Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Paula B. Pretlow, trustee of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation.
I know it's hard to walk into a room and see friends and start having conversations and then realize, oh, I gotta get in my seat. There will be lots of time to socialize and have conversation. We really, really appreciate your being here. This is an incredible turnout, and we're just so happy to have you all here. So, welcome to San Francisco, and welcome to the first National Jewish Poverty Convening. It's such a pleasure to be hosting this important event in Weinberg Foundation's newest priority city and my hometown. This is where I live. Today is a special day. We're hoping to reinvigorate an important dialogue focused on enabling our Jewish families, mothers, fathers, children, our Jewish friends and neighborhoods throughout the United States who are experiencing poverty, and help them to achieve a better life. It's not something we talk about very much at all, and it is very, very important that we do. The Bay Area is a fitting location to have this conversation. Perhaps more than any other place in America, it offers a stark example of income inequality in our nation. This is a city that has seen unprecedented growth and opportunity, but it also has a widening disparities in all areas. The Bay Area is a global hub for technology, entrepreneurship, and innovation, but it is also home to one of the most pressing affordable housing and homelessness crises in this country. With everyday challenges like securing affordable housing, maintaining employment, and ensuring that healthy food is on the table, poverty can resemble a labyrinth or a maze, like the one you see included in our branding for this event. We have to find a way to better support those in our community who are navigating this maze day in and day out. As we focus specifically on Jewish poverty during today's program, we're going to share both what we know while also being honest about what we don't know. People carry preconceptions about what low-income Jewish people look like and where they live. These are often inaccurate, rooted in stereotypes, and fail to take into consideration the significant differences that exist from community to community and from household to household. For example, while in most places throughout the United States, older adults exhibit the highest levels of poverty, here in San Francisco, according to data from the recent Bay Area community study, Jewish poverty is more concentrated among younger adults. You'll hear later from Rabbi Ryan Bauer, who has led my synagogue, Temple Emmanuel, in spearheading an initiative to combat homelessness within that population. Each of Weinberg's trustees are present at today's convening, showing that our foundation's serious commitment to addressing Jewish poverty. This includes our board chair, Rob Kelly, Ambassador Faye HARTOG-LEVIN, and Gordon Berlin. So on behalf of the Weinberg Foundation's trustees, all of whom you will hear from today, I again want to welcome you. I'm Paula Pretlow, and also to say thank you. Thank you for caring about those in our community who are most in need of our services. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our fearless leader and our CEO, Rachel GARBOW, to talk about how this convening came to be and give you a sense of what to expect from this afternoon. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Rachel GARBOW, President and CEO of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation.
Good afternoon. I should say it's Tzoharayim Tov. Thank you all very much for coming. It's just a thrill. If you just take a moment and look around the room and see who is here, we took a leap of faith in doing this, and you'll hear in a moment how many are in the room. I first want to thank Paula for welcoming everybody here and for welcoming us to your community and for being part of the Weinberg Foundation. It is really a pleasure. I also want to thank each of our trustees for being here today, flying across the country at an ungodly hour and flying back home at an ungodly hour, like many of us are doing. I also want to acknowledge many of my colleagues who are here today who made this happen. And I'm going to just ask them to embarrassingly wave or stand up or do whatever they would like. Jonathan Hornstein, Rafi Rohn, Aaron Murky, Arlene Cox, Craig Demchek, Yvonne Spohr, Megan Franey, Jan Banks, Kayla Bowers, and Jonathan Hook and David Gilmore, who are all here. I thank you all very much. I want to acknowledge that it was about a year ago at a gathering of Jewish Federation CEOs and Jewish Foundation CEOs from around the United States that this issue of Jewish poverty was placed squarely on the table. Those of us in attendance, including many who are in the room today, recognize that we have too little research, data, and information concerning the reality of Jewish poverty in the US. Following the gathering, Weinberg Foundation staff undertook the responsibility of collecting all available research on the topic. What we found, other than materials from Pew, a few Jewish federations, and a few other organizations, regrettably, is very, very little. So, we collated what we found, which you have in your materials today, and there are a few key things to share with you. 1, 20% of Jewish households in the US earn less than $30,000 annually, and 7% earn less than $15,000 annually. 2, Jewish poverty is not just represented by immigrants from the former Soviet Union, who are primarily Russian speakers, and many of whom are survivors, or ultra-Orthodox Jews. In several ways, Jewish poverty in the US mirrors society as a whole, including single mothers and their children, adults with disabilities, and many families who are living paycheck to paycheck, one emergency away from everything falling apart. 3, in New York City, the number of Jewish households living below 150% of the federal poverty level, or $15,000 for a single adult in New York City, is 20%, which is double the percentage from several years ago. We are going in the wrong direction. Perhaps the most important takeaway is that we have a lot of work to do to fully understand Jewish poverty in the US, let alone to understand the best interventions to provide meaningful support. By answering the question, what does Jewish poverty look like, we can start to answer the more important questions. What are the best programmatic interventions and solutions? Are we replicating best practices? What are JCCs, JFSs, and others doing regarding comprehensive service delivery? What about elder abuse? What about job training and financial literacy? Where do we go and what is the vision? And how are we going to genuinely engage those we serve so that our discussion and decision tables are truly reflective of our communities and what they would like? What is the story that we want to tell? This is the work we hope to begin today together. The convening today is the first time in 29 years the Weinberg Foundation has done anything like this. We put it together in a matter of months by the staff who I mentioned a few minutes ago. There are more than 220 leaders in this room, representing 19 states, Washington, D.C., Canada, and the former Soviet Union. You are clergy, you are professional and lay leaders, you are Jewish Federation leaders and Foundation leaders, you are Jewish agency leaders from the JCC, Jewish Family Services, Jewish Vocational Services, and more. You are representing small and mighty startup entrepreneurial nonprofits, you represent research, and you represent the media and press outlets across the country. The attendance here today, in numbers, in geographic reach, and in professional and volunteer backgrounds, speaks to the magnitude of the issue of poverty in our community. And it is also a result of the terrific slate of speakers who you will be hearing from today. You have the schedule in front of you, but I'm going to go through it very quickly. In a moment, you will hear from our impressive keynote panel, which will frame what we know and what we don't know about Jewish poverty and poverty in the community at large. You will then be invited to join a breakout discussion based on the newly authored papers that address different aspects of Jewish poverty. We expect these to be active conversations, So as I say to the Weinberg Foundation team, be blunt. Do not be shy. Make your voice and your vision heard. Then we will come back together to hear short talks on 3 very different, effective, and inspiring approaches to improving the lives of low-income individuals and families in the Jewish community from around the country. Finally, we will announce what is next on this journey, and we will invite you to join us. I want to thank each of the speakers for taking their time to be with us today. Their bios are in your materials. So let's get to it. I am pleased to introduce Gordon Berlin, our newest trustee and president of MDRC, who will lead our keynote panel. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Gordon Berlin, trustee of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, as well as our keynote panel, whom he will introduce.
So I want to join Paula and Rachel in welcoming all of you and thanking you very, very much for staying on here in San Francisco to participate in this panel and in the convening that's going to follow. We're going to be discussing what we know about poverty and near poverty in the Jewish community, and both how it's similar to and different than poverty in the broader U.S. population. And we also want to identify, as Rachel said, key gaps in our knowledge. And then I'm hopeful that as we develop a more nuanced understanding, that we'll be able to craft a strategic response that really represents the nature of the Jewish poverty problem and hopefully the broader poverty problem in our own individual communities. But before we jump in, let me introduce our wonderful panel. Here on my left is Alan Cooperman. He's the Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center, as well as the author of A Portrait of Jewish Americans, which is really the seminal 2013 Pew Research Center report on and survey of the United States Jewish population. Among other areas, Alan is going to talk to us about the data that we have, and I think the right way to characterize that would be the lack of data that we have in being able to effectively describe Jewish poverty and how to think about advancing that agenda. And then next over is Wes Moore. Wes is the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, a leading anti-poverty pioneer based in New York. And he'll be providing a national perspective on the poverty problem, identifying national trends, talking with us a little bit about underlying causes, and based on his experience both in New York and Baltimore and as a leader in the field, in solutions that we all can begin to think about and tailor to our local communities. And finally, last but first, is Sarah Abramson. She's the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Impact at the Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Boston. She's going to share her perspective from the front lines of serving low-income Jews in Boston, and she has helped to spearhead their anti-poverty initiative, which began in 2015. So as Rachel said, our goal is to set the stage for the day's discussion, and we'll start by providing a broad overview of the problem and possible steps that we can take, and then we hope you'll all join us to continue the conversation in the interactive breakout sessions where the panelists will also participate and where we can go much deeper into the issues identified. So before I turn it over to our experts, I want to first provide a little bit more context by sharing some unique aspects of Jewish poverty in the United States as compared to poverty more broadly. So as Rachel indicated and I just said, our starting point is the glaring lack of good research and data to understand the Jewish poverty program in the United States, at least as compared to the broader poverty issues more generally in the United States. And of course, that's a big part of the reason why we're having this convening today. We want to learn more about the issue and call attention to the need for more and better data. But there are some things we do know, looking at this study in New York City that was referred to earlier that UGA supported, and comparing that information to the snippets of information we have from the study that Alan did and from some of the studies that some of you participated in your individual communities. And when I was looking at this information, I think the first thing that really jumped out at me was that geography really matters. New York City and its surrounding areas include the largest number of poor and near poor Jewish households, as you just heard. And while Jews overall exhibit higher income compared to other faith communities, 20% of Jewish households in New York City fall below 150% of the federal poverty level. I think for those of us in New York, that was pretty shocking. You know, it really has helped to galvanize a lot more attention there at UJA and more broadly. Now, we don't have great comparable data on to the data that UJA collected in the rest of the nation, but we do know that New York, in some sense, is an outlier. If you look across the country, it's probably got a larger, higher proportion of individuals in Jewish families and households in poverty than other locations. For example, in Indianapolis, less than 2% of the population is below the federal poverty line. A second thing that really jumped out at me is it's very important to consider the ethnographic makeup of the Jewish population versus the United States as a whole. Two of the Jewish populations that are disproportionately low income in New York City are Hasidic Jews, the ultra-Orthodox population, and immigrants from the former Soviet Union, many of whom are elderly, and that's a group that also includes, but isn't certainly not limited to, Holocaust survivors. Now, many associate these two populations unique to the Jewish community most closely with Jewish poverty. And if they were talking just about New York City, they would be right. But even in New York, and certainly in the rest of the country, as best as we can tell from the information we do have, Jewish poverty looks similar to poverty as experienced in the broader population. It's comprised of single mothers, the working poor, other families struggling with unemployment and underemployment, and of course, that's consistent with widening inequality, which has been a trend that really has been underway for 4 decades in the United States, and which I think we have not adequately addressed in any form. And in New York broadly, about 8% of the population of households include an individual with a disability. And Jewish households have similar percentages as best as we can tell. And that really makes addressing the question and the challenge of achieving economic stability all that much harder for those individuals. So in short, the nature of Jewish poverty varies by the interaction of geography and ethnicity, and in some cases age, which means that the solution really does have to be tailored to all of our individual communities. And last, I think it's important that we really keep in mind as the discussion goes on the assumptions that are underlying this discussion. For example, the connection between race and poverty in America is generally a salient one. But there's no research really that we are confident of that can support the claim that Jews of color are disproportionately low income. Some studies seem to say that it was, other studies seem to say that it wasn't. Secondly, and I think importantly, the media portrayal of American Jews today simply doesn't really include poverty as a dimension of Jewish life in any real way. In addition, despite the number of poor Jewish households across the country, historically, Jewish poverty and improvements in the safety net have not really been a focus of Jewish philanthropy. We've often favored other areas of giving instead. Well, fortunately, there's quite a bit of knowledge in the United States about poverty interventions broadly, for single parents, for the elderly, for the working poor. And because many aspects of poverty in the Jewish community mirror the country at large, we can draw on what we know about how best to serve low-income families when developing interventions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over first, I think, to Wes to give us some sense of his perspective on the fight against poverty in New York City and nationally. Wes?
Great, thank you so much. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to participate today. I think it's not just meaningful for me personally, in the fact that, running Robin Hood, we have programs that are working specifically and exclusively on these issues. But I think it also really helps to highlight the larger underlying fact that Jewish poverty is not just an issue for the Jewish community. It's an issue for all of our communities. And when you're looking at the levels of disparity that exist, these are issues that we should all be focused on. And it's the same way, frankly, where we could have never made progress in the civil rights movement had it not been for our Jewish brothers and sisters who recognized that that was their problem too. And you know, we have to be honest and recognize the fact that, you know, when we have an outrage like what happens in New Zealand, one of the first congregations, one of the first larger groups that actually stands up and not only condemns the acts but provides levels of support and prayer is the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. These are not exclusive issues that one group should have to deal with, because it really brings us back to our basic humanity. It brings us back to the thing that actually is the common bond, and as you all lay out, see on the hashtags back here, is our common responsibility. And knowing the fact that we have far too many people who frankly still continue to feel left out. And the thing that we notice in this larger poverty conversation that we see both in New York and also from a national perspective isn't just the fact that poverty is there. It's the fact that it's so persistent. It's the fact that it's so sticky. It's the fact that it's so predictable. And we see these trends and how these trends continue to develop, and how when we're looking at this issue of poverty, when we're looking at this issue of economic mobility, when we're looking at this issue of support, there's a couple real, very distinct phenomenon that I think we have to wrestle with as we're watching how this thing continues to evolve. The first thing I think we have to wrestle with is the fact that for many people who are living in poverty, just simply getting them right above the poverty line is not enough. You know, we look at New York City alone. And in New York City alone, the statistics are that for a person who is living in poverty who moves out of poverty, 34% of them will be back in poverty within a year. 34%. When you're looking at the statistics in just New York alone, 42% of all New Yorkers have been in poverty at some point in the past 3 years. We're watching this larger revolving door of poverty that becomes really heartbreaking. And so the goal then becomes, how are we making sure and coming up with best practices that are not making poverty more tolerable or easier, but actually significantly and sustainably moving families out of poverty, moving households out of poverty. The second dynamic, and I think it's an important one because we've heard it alluded to, I think, with Paula's comments, Rachel's comments, Gordon's comments, is the reality that we also have to be honest about what the face of poverty is. Think about the fact that we right now are at historic unemployment levels in this country. But you know what hasn't moved? The poverty rate. In fact, if anything, it's ticking up. Explain how those two dynamics can exist at the same time. Historic unemployment rates, but then poverty rates staying level. When we're talking about people living in poverty, and people talk about this proximity of poverty, when we're talking about people living in poverty, oftentimes the face of poverty is the person who is new to the country or new to the city, or the person who is on the streets and so on and so forth. That is a person who potentially is in poverty, right? But the proximity to poverty is much closer than any of us realize. The reality of what we're talking about right now is every single one of us, whether you realize it or not, today have probably interacted with a person who's living in poverty and didn't even know it. Whether it was the place you had breakfast and the person who was serving you coffee. Whether it was the hotel that you were staying in and the person who's cleaning up the room right now as we speak. The face of poverty continues to evolve and continues to change. And then with that, I think we then have to take those type of data dynamics and those type of heart-led dynamics to be able to find and identify and come up with real solutions that are both going to come from the way we can think about our philanthropy in creative ways, but then also thinking about new and creative ways we can leverage our philanthropy to actually address the structural challenges that are creating such a distinct pipeline into poverty and making it so difficult for people to fall out of. And so I think from a local and a national perspective, being able to rethink how people talk about, how people envision, and how people understand their proximity to poverty is, I think, one of the core things that we have to focus on when it comes to actually being able to address those structural and systemic dynamics that actually exist, that are creating those type of stats that I think for many people, as they hear them, are not just unbearable, but just truthfully heartbreaking.
It's a bit of an unusual situation for me, being sort of the data guy. When Jonathan Hornstein from the Weinberg Foundation contacted me several months ago to get all the data that we have about Jewish poverty, I provided it to him very easily because there just wasn't very much. And I told him that right away. And when I was invited to speak here, the first thing I said is, we just don't know very much. And they said, well, please come and say that. So it's pretty easy. I feel it's like a Catholic session. Here's my public confession. We just don't have very good data on Jewish poverty. Now, I could say a little more. I can explain why that is, at least to some extent. And it's not entirely because it's been an overlooked subject or because we don't care. It's not entirely because we don't know that there's Jewish poverty. There's several things going on. First and foremost, we have excellent data in the United States nationally on poverty by race and ethnicity. So we have census data. We don't have census data on Jews. The US Census Bureau has not asked individual Americans about their religion since 1957. And in 1957, they did it once. And there was an outcry, including from the Jewish community, and they've never done it again. So we don't have any federal data on Jewish poverty. We got lots of federal data on poverty, but not on Jewish poverty. Now, that means all the data we do have comes from surveys of the kind that we do. When we do these surveys, among the biggest areas of item non-response, i.e. questions that people don't like to answer, is questions about income. People don't like to be asked on the telephone or in person or online about how much money they make. To encourage people to answer that question, we, like almost every pollster, ask that question in bands. You've all taken a survey at some point. You were asked, is your income, just stop me when I get to, is it below 25,000, below 50,000, below 75,000, so on. It goes something like that. You're asked in these broad bounds. You're not asked a specific amount. And that's not just to save time. That's to get more people to answer the question. Then even when we do get that question, well, what do we got? We've got income. Income? Income is only a tiny fraction of the story. Look, in the United States, median income of whites is higher than blacks. Everybody knows that. But by a factor of, 150, 200%. Wealth, household wealth, it's a factor of 20 times, 2,000%. So if all we have is income, we really only have a small part of the picture. Now, there are surveys, like the panel study of income dynamics. There are some data sets out there that do gather wealth information. They have to send someone intrusively, properly, but intrusively into a respondent's home, ask them to pull papers out, et cetera, get this information, and they do gather it. But those surveys tend not to have good data on Jews either. There's some, but not much. What do we do have? We have, for example, the 2013 Jewish study. I didn't do it alone, by the way. Very kind of you to call it my study. My colleagues are here. It's a cast of many, many people, a lot of effort, and I thank you all for helping with that study, and I hope you'll help us the next time around, and I hope next time around we'll gather better data on poverty among Jews. In one of our breakout sessions with Lawrence Kotler-Berkowitz and my colleague Becca Alper, we'll be talking about how we can try to gather better data on Jews the next time we do it. But in 2013, we asked income, right? So you showed the number. 20% of American Jews tell us that they have income less than household income less than $30,000 a year. But if you look at that group is disproportionately made up of people who are either quite young or quite old. So household income for that group, well, it's an indicator, but it isn't precisely a measure of poverty because some of those folks are probably students. Some of those folks are probably retirees. Their income may be low, but they may actually be pretty well off. Now, I don't know that, but I can't assume that all those people are in poverty. Similarly, you mentioned the Haredi population. Actually, one of the stunning things in our survey is that 24% of Haredi respondents told us they had household incomes of $150,000 or more. It was one of the things that when people looked at the study, they were really surprised at. But remember, those are household incomes. And Haredim are very likely to have multiple wage earners and maybe even multiple generations of wage earners living in the same household. So again, there's so much that we don't know, even though we have some of these figures. And generally speaking, I think we do know, we can see that the Jewish population in the United States is on average better educated than the American population as a whole, and better off financially. How much better off? We also don't, frankly, have very good detail at the high end. Again, we tend to top out with asking people about income over $150,000. We don't ask people, do you make millions of dollars? Do you have tens of millions of dollars? And were we to try to ask those questions, I think, again, our item non-response would be very high. So with that, again, it's a huge mea culpa. We do not have good data on Jewish poverty. We need better data, but it's not just because we don't care, we don't want it. It's actually a remarkably difficult thing to get at.
Yes, so thank you so much. This is quite an exciting day for those of us who've been doing this for a long time and really could care about nothing more than this particular issue. I've been thinking, as my colleagues have been talking, about we don't know enough about the individual experience and we don't know about the demographics of Jews in poverty. But most of us in this room probably do know about the community's response to this issue. And I believe that the lack of a consistent and coherent community response is part of the impetus for this gathering. And that is what's within our control. And I've been thinking, as we've been talking about, we don't know about this, we don't have the data. Well, what I do know is, having run a cash assistance agency, how many times I picked up the phone and I heard a click on the other end. And then the phone would ring a couple hours later and I would pick it up again, and there would be nobody there. And a couple more hours would go by, or a couple more days, or a couple more weeks, and suddenly the person would be on the other end of the line. And we would get to talking, because our model is all about dignity and clients at the center, because they're not really clients. They're our friends, they're our community members, they're the people that we're interacting with every day, as Wes said. And I would eventually ask them, why is it that it took you so many times to make this phone call? You hung up again. And they would inevitably, invariably tell me, because the call to the Jewish community is the hardest call I've made. And my experience, having grown up in a community-bound Jewish community where my sense of identity was around being part of something, was inconsistent with the idea that that phone call was so hard to make. And that motivated us at CJP, Boston's Jewish Federation, to say, what is behind this issue? And yes, we care about it. You know, it's not that we don't care, but why is it that this has not been a priority? One person hanging up is one too many people, when your whole mission and reason to be is to engage people in what it means to be part of a thriving ecosystem of a Jewish community that's engaged. And we took seriously that part of this was about understanding what the role of a Jewish Federation was as a backbone organization. We are not a direct service organization. We could pretend that we were, and we could try and take this issue on, but we would have failed. So we had to approach this particular issue with an incredible amount of humility that really, I have to be honest, was new for us in some ways, to think about, how do you do this? Oh, there's some Federation and non-Federation people in the room, I could tell. How do you do this with the community at the heart? Not what's best for CJP, not what's best for the 6 social service agencies that took a leap of faith with us and did this. And that was by putting those who do the work, the social workers, at the heart of the model. The second component to this is data. We are data obsessed in the work that we do, because we have to be, because we could continue, and it is important to provide Band-Aid solutions. I believe that you do not work on your resume when you're sleeping in your car. You just don't. You have to be able to get someone out of the immediate crisis. But that is not enough, and that is where we stopped as a federation before. We stopped after the Band-Aid. We never gave the stitches. We never understood what the diagnosis was behind that. Once we moved on to the data and we understood what the issue is, we could iterate on our program design, and we stopped doing programs that didn't work, and we continued to do programs that did work. And that's where the humility really has to come in again. And the third component of our model has been deep, deep collaboration, has been about working with our social service partner agencies as equal partners. Many of them are here today. They've traveled across the country because they are as invested in this model as we are, and possibly more so. They are the front line, actually, of the work. And we have locked ourselves in rooms, and we have fought and fought and fought, but we don't allow ourselves out of the room until we understand how we're going to move forward. And that, again, is different and new for CJP and for many federations. So what did we learn with this data obsession and the collaboration? For us, we've been doing this for about 3.5 years now, and we have reached and served a total of about 6,000 unique clients, unique community members. And our community members have an average income of $15,000 a year. So this is objective poverty by most measures. They are highly educated. 70% of our clients have a college degree or higher. So that's less than the general Boston Jewish community, which is 87% college educated. It's an astounding number, but it is much higher. So if you take the secular community, the broad community, and you look at the same income bracket, and you look at the same geographical reach, only 19% of people in that same income bracket have a college degree. So what is going on here? We couldn't take an off-the-shelf poverty solution, of which there aren't very many, and apply it to this population. And so what we have done is to look at root causes. What are the underlying contributing factors? And again, I feel it's so fitting to be here in San Francisco because unsurprisingly to those of you who live here, the root causes are housing and mental health within the Jewish community. And we can't solve those two issues exclusively within the Jewish community. So we have had to create coalitions beyond the Jewish community in order to engage in this work. And we're working with the United Way and Bank of America Foundation on these issues because, again, we have not, as a Jewish community, prioritized poverty, but we also have not prioritized mental health. And the last thing I would just say is that it strikes me, because many of us go to lots of conferences all the time about the future of the Jewish community and what does it mean to be a thriving community and how do we get the next generation engaged. To me, this has always been a question of engagement as much as anything. When that person hung up the phone on me several times, she was also letting go of her synagogue membership because she couldn't afford it. She was also not going to the JCC because she didn't want the dues abatement, but she also just did not want to see her friends and be asked how she was doing. So that component of it, what does it mean to be a community who prioritizes this issue, doesn't matter if it's a big or small issue. It matters that it's a mark of who we are as a community, and I think we have a long, long way to go.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with some questions that really come out of what I've heard from all of you. I'm thinking a little bit about, poverty's persistence and stigma that Sarah just spoke about. When Wes spoke, he raised this challenge of unemployment rate versus poverty and the bigger challenge of upward mobility. And all of you, including Alan, have emphasized the integral nature of the poverty problem. It's not really just a Jewish poverty problem. It's part of the broader problem. So in philanthropy, how should we be thinking about how we approach solutions more broadly? Do we try to help those who are from Jewish communities integrate into existing poverty programming? Do we develop specialized programming? How transferable are some of the solutions? It would be great to hear some of your perspectives on that set of challenges. At the Weinberg Foundation, we do both. We're really all about poverty broadly, and we care a lot about the Jewish community, and we make grants that interact in those two worlds repeatedly. But there are many different ways to go about it, and I'm struck that more broadly in Jewish philanthropy, we haven't really been thinking directly about the Jewish poverty problem. So I don't know. Who wants to take that on?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So talk about breaking mental models. Part of what you have to do when you begin to think about how do you prioritize data in an issue that really is all about heart. We don't want to take the humanity out of the issue. So we had to work with our philanthropic community in Boston, and we're incredibly lucky to have such a generous community amongst us and around us to help break the model of what does it mean to give tzedakah to those in need. And it's fitting, we're coming up in Purim, where part of the mitzvot around Purim is to give to those in need. And a lot of us grew up thinking that is how you demonstrate your commitment to poverty. It's the individual that we want to change. For us, this was asking people to believe in systemic change. This was asking people to believe that we're not going to do this one person at a time, but we're going to change the ecosystem in which we engage. And that was hard. It was incredibly hard. And for us, to be very specific, it required one family foundation to believe that this was the way to go. And having the data that we were able to invest their resources on then drove those compelling stories. Then the story was about what does our community look like today, and what did it look like 5 years ago, and what will it look like in 5 years ago? And that touches people's hearts as much as the individual story.
Wes, could you say a few words about the solutions as you're thinking about this constellation of problems?
Absolutely. I think that one thing that all of us collectively, when we think about our goals and the things that we have to accomplish for all of our organizations, I feel like every one of our organizations needs to add a statement of partner better. Mm-hmm. There's not a single issue that any of us are working on that we alone are going to fix, that any of us have the capital nor the capacity to fix on our own. And it's been really interesting because I've in fact, come May, I'll be starting my third year at Robinhood. And one of the things we did was, when I first took over at Robinhood, was spending time with all of our community partners, all of our leaders, to include Gordon, and people in the community, because there's a core philosophy, and I love what you're saying, because there's a core belief that we have organizationally, is that it's the reality that the people who are closest to the challenge are going to be closest to the solution. We're never going to find the solutions that we need by being in conferences. It's going to it's being in the streets. It's by being in the communities. It's by being in the neighborhoods. And the fascinating thing about, and why partnership matters, is that the organizations that we are working with that are focusing on specific things, when you ask them what thing are you most concerned about, it was never what they were focusing on. So, for example, the community partners that we fund in the space of education, and we'd say, what is taking up the most of your mind share right now? Their answer was mental health. The people who were working in housing and our housing portfolio, what thing are you guys really focusing on? Transportation. The people who were working in jobs, in job training portfolio, you ask them, what thing is taking up so much of your time right now? Their answer, criminal justice. Every one of these things are interconnected. And when you're talking about poverty, essentially what you're talking about is a fundamental breakdown. There's been a fundamental breakdown when you have a family or a community that is mired in this level of poverty. And the only way you're going to address that is a fundamental build-up, is by saying, you know what, if I can get this lane, who's covering down on this lane that I can partner with to make sure that we're actually coming up with a cohesive solution to a larger problem? I have a good friend who runs an organization in New York, and he parallels it actually to the medical side, where he said it's kind of like you're driving in a car and then you get into this massive car accident. And the police come and the ambulance comes and everything, and they bring you to the hospital, and you're being rushed into the emergency room, and you got banged up pretty bad in this car accident. And you're in the emergency room, and then a doctor walks into the emergency room and takes one look at you and says, "Oh, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. Doctor, I need everything. I'm in really bad shape right now. And I cannot have someone look at me and say, I'm an orthopedic surgeon." We have to be able to approach this problem with the complexity that this problem requires. And so I think one thing that we have to collectively do as we're thinking about what we have to do, again, for each and every one of us, our goal has got to be partner better. Find people that are working on issues that might not be our specialty, and find people to help us cover down on the collective problem that we're all trying to fundamentally solve.
So, Alan, given the responses that we just heard, how do we get at underlying causes, given the absence of really good data? And maybe you could say a word or two about how to think about it in your community, but also what solutions are available on the national side.
Sure. Well, I thought that Sarah and Wes gave brilliant answers, and I should acknowledge that the Pew Research Center is a non-advocacy research center, so we don't advocate policy solutions. So I'm not quite in a position to do that. But I'm going to give a little bit of a roundabout answer, but I'm going to try to answer. we study religion in the United States, and we study Jews as part of that picture. And again, when we study Jews, I'm struck by how the trends that I see among American Jews are so parallel to the trends that I see in American religion as a whole. Jews sometimes, actually quite often, differ in degree, but they very rarely, in fact, I can't even think of an example in which Jews really differ in kind. So all the trends of disaffiliation that we see in the United States, we see among Jews. All the trends, the differences by generation, we see among Jews by generation. All the differences we see in patterns across the country geographically, we see among Jews, and so on. I don't see any reason to think that the lack of data among Jews somehow means that Jews are going to be different in kind from the rest of the US population. We breathe the same air, we drink the same water, we live in the same economic system. So the lack of data specifically on Jews should not, in my view, be paralyzing, because we have quite a lot of data. We know quite a lot a bit about poverty in general. Now, do we know exactly what, is there a silver bullet answer? I don't know, and that's not my role here, but the trends about poverty. So Wes said, look, how is it we can have historically low unemployment rates while the poverty rate remains high? Well, we have growing numbers of working poor in the United States. That's a mega trend, working poor. Is that going to be true among Jews too? Yes, of course it's going to be. I mean, I don't know this, but is there any reason to suppose that it isn't also going to be the case among American Jews? No. What about, Wes talked about the 34% cycling in and out, or another way of thinking about it is if we have data over people's lifetimes, we see that the number of people who are in poverty or close to poverty over the course of a lifetime is much greater than the number who are in poverty at any particular moment. So our current poverty numbers are really an understatement of the size of the problem. They're cycling in and out, and particularly people who are in may cycle out, but are much more likely then to cycle back in. Is that going to be different among Jews than everybody else? No. I mean, the absolute numbers may be lower, but it's going to be the same issue. What about rising income inequality? Do we really think that that's not going to be true in the Jewish population? No. And what about more people living in multifamily households, partly as a result of choice, but also partly as a result of economic circumstance? What about the declining share by generation of people who consider themselves to be middle class? And the definition of what's middle class is a tough one, but if you keep some consistent definitions, you can make quite plausible arguments that the number of Americans who are in the middle class is actually declining as well. Do we think that that's going to be true for Jews as well? Of course. So more maybe middle class or even well off, but is that increasing, or certainly by generation, the sense of economic insecurity, the lack of confidence that our children and our children's children will be better off economically than we are? We see that in the general population. Do we not think that that's going to be the case? Maybe not to the same degree, but certainly in kind. So again, I would say all the things that you see in the general population, you're going to see among Jews as well.
And can I say that's an incredibly important point, right? And it continues to remind us of the fact that when we're looking at all these macro trends, it talks about it really harkens on the idea of what becomes the role of philanthropy in all of that to address that, right? I mean, just if you take a look at recent history, and you look at a program that Robin was very proud to be a part of, and you take a look at the Hebrew Free Loan Society, right? So the Hebrew Free Loan Society, which is led by a gentleman named David Rosen. And so as you watch how these organizations are doing heroic work at a time when more than ever they were being called on to do heroic work, and frankly in pretty unfair circumstances. And specifically for the initiative that we're talking about with this, we're talking about an initiative where the Hebrew Free Loan Society were making grants to, and it was an employer-based platform, to where they were making grants to individuals, again, employer-based, working people who needed loans, interest-free and interest-free loans to people who needed it, primarily for people like government workers who during the government shutdown, where despite the fact that they had a good job, were now finding themselves within a paycheck or two needing to go to food banks to be able to provide for their families. That's something that philanthropy played an incredibly important role of filling a hole, of something that was a structural and systemic breakdown. So when we're talking about the role and how do we then fund things that we think are going to become important in the way we think about our large society, making sure that we have these platforms that can address a very human pain and a very human need at the moment that that human pain and human need is felt is incredibly important. But we also have a collective responsibility of talking about why that human pain exists in the first place, why that human pain is even real, why we have a situation where we have people who are employed who will leave their job at the end of the day to go pick up their children from school and report to a homeless shelter. Why we have people who are employed who then have to go to the Barclays Center because the Barclays Center is working with the New York City Food Bank to create a food pantry. Our collective voice in this is as important as our collective philanthropy. And the fact that we do have a significant responsibility to be able to not just raise awareness, but raise urgency around the fact that there are structural problems that are making every one of our organizations necessary. Dr. King has a quote that actually sits on my, and Gordon has seen it, and my colleague Nisha Patel has seen it, sits on my desk, and it says, "Philanthropy is admirable, but the philanthropist must also recognize the economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary." We are dealing with economic injustice. And that's the environment in which every single one of us have to do our work. And being able to address the upstream is just as important as being able to treat the downstream.
So with that eloquent statement, I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists. We intend to pick up on all of these issues in the breakout sessions and discussions and panels that are going to follow this one. So thank you again very, very much.
Thank you so much. Can't wait.
Nice job. Les, you rocked it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Ambassador Faye Hartog-LEVIN, trustee of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you, Gordon, Wes, Alan, and Sarah for what was a wonderful stage setter for the conversations that are going to continue, and for hopefully provoking some questions that we will ask this afternoon and into the future. I'm very proud to be a trustee and associated with the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, not just because of the work that has been done in the past 29 years, but because of what we're dedicated to doing, such as this convening. And we have a most amazing staff that pulled this together. I think this is a phenomenal undertaking, and of course led by our wonderful leader, Rachel MONROE. And for that, I want to express my sincere thanks to all of the staff and to Rachel for doing this. You now have a chance to participate in an interactive breakout session. You might have or should have selected one when you registered. If not, the staff at the table outside will help you and direct you to the rooms where they will be. Just to remind you, there are papers, the concept papers for each of the breakout sessions was included in your bag, and you can check those if you would like to decide which session to attend if you have not already. But just to review, there will be a session including Alan COOPERMAN on advancing research on Jewish poverty. There'll be a session on innovative approaches to combating hunger. Another one, Jewish poverty in the media. Another with Sarah Abramson on the no wrong door approach. There is another session entitled The Silent Predictor, which is the intersection of gender and Jewish poverty. And finally, addressing the unmet need of vulnerable Holocaust survivors. The sessions will be 45 minutes and promptly so that we can reconvene to hear some bright spot presentations afterwards. Thank you very much and enjoy the sessions.